All right, yeah, we should be live as of this moment. And one, two, three, and okay, yeah, okay. So we're good to go. All right, so hello and welcome to the second episode of the Canada Files Canada news stream, where we're focusing on domestic Canadian politics. So I have a few special guests joining me, and one that'll be hopefully hopping on with us in a few minutes. So thank you to Andre and Rory for coming on. So obviously, I'm the editor in chief of the Canada Files now. Andre, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, it's nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Aidan. I'm Andre Goulet. I'm the executive director of Harbinger Media Network, home of many good podcasts like Alberta Advantage, 49th Parahell, Tech Won't Save Us, and a lot of others. So I'm really happy to be here because I love talking about Canadian politics. And I also host the show at Harbinger, Harbinger Society Presents, where I talk about Canadian politics a lot. So this will be fun. And it's my first time meeting Rory, which is really exciting.
Yeah, so I'm Rory. I'm a researcher, writer, and contributor to the Alberta Advantage. And yeah, it's great to meet Andre. And this is like the second like podcast slash live stream I've been on. I normally usually just do stuff for the Alberta Advantage, so this will be fun.
And it's cool that you broke out your library background, which is very professional. And I see you got a lot of good books there.
Yeah, I mean, it looks a little bit better than the bedroom I'm sitting in. Like, has a better background. That's just basically out in my living room. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a sampling of a lot of the books that we use to write Alberta Advantage episodes. So lots of
Awesome.
like kind of regional history and political economy.
And Aidan, if I may, I'm not rich, so I don't have like rich people paintings. I am just dog sitting at my father's home, which is the explanation for the rich people paintings behind me.
Oh, oh, okay. I was gonna say the paintings are pretty decent behind
It's
us.
very
So
nice, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm actually a pretty big art gallery person myself, which obviously I miss going to. So I can appreciate some good art where I see it. So all right. Yeah, so obviously the idea for today is to try to focus more on basically East and Western Canada where possible. You know, I think basically a lot of the news sources. I mean, we have good ones at least. I'd say Tai, Walrus, some of them, but I feel like the news I've done with the Canada Files admittedly has been that. So have to do a special one today. So now, Rory, I want to ask you. So what's going on with Alberta, man? Kenny, we're removing restrictions. Like, what the heck's going on?
Well, pipelines. That's basically the thing that matters most in Alberta. And removing the restrictions is like basically creating a new pipeline for a virus. So that's what we're doing in Alberta, I guess.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's such a good idea.
But a little more seriously, it's the removing the restriction stuff is that essentially Kenny's been facing pressure from small business, particularly like rural small business, which is like an important part of the UCP constituency, has been basically threatening to ignore the public health orders and just open. And Kenny kind of folded on it pretty quickly as soon as they started to do that. And uh, there's not, I mean, the number of new cases per day has been trending downwards as a result of the lockdown, the second lockdown. And well, we'll see what happens afterwards. I think that the government is just, praying that the vaccination rate is going to accelerate through the spring so that ultimately it won't really matter if they reopen. But I mean, given the speed at which the government has been vaccinating people and just sort of the chaos it's been, I wouldn't put any money on it.
Well, one amazing thing about the provincial governments and their sort of actions with the pandemic is that they know.
Oh, I think we've had Andre freeze on us.
Yeah, we've had Andre freeze on us. I thought that was just me, but Okay. All right. While Andre freezes, we have a chance to introduce our other guest, Lana. Lana, welcome to the stream. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi. Thanks for having me. Sorry I'm late.
Yeah. No worries. So basically, for people who may not know about the work you do, can you tell people a little bit about that?
Hi. So I'm pretty much a tech writer. I write about art and labor mostly from the games industry side. I've written about um, local game companies. For example, there was a QA third-party company here called Keywords. I wrote a piece for Rank and File about how they had kept their offices open for no reason, even though they could fully afford to have people work from home. And the nature of the work allows for that. They had people coming into the office several weeks into the pandemic before they were forced to shut down. So I write a lot about the sort of labor side of cultural production in the tech world. And I run a stream called the Freak Museum where I play games that you probably haven't heard of. My whole kind of bread and butter is just really weird stuff. I like the sort of like weird avant-garde of the interactive arts, and that's kind of always been my focus. So I run a stream where I play games just from the off the beaten path, like stuff you probably have not heard of, or if you have heard of, you've probably forgotten about it. So that's who I am. So I'm a freelance writer and a streamer and an artist.
All right. Yeah. So now you were on a podcast recently. I believe it was 49th Parahell. How'd you get on? How'd you get on there?
So I happen to just kind of know Rob Rousseau. It's classic. It's basically just, you have to know people in the industry. And no, Rob and I are friends. We live in the same city. I hang out in his stream all the time, and I'm a horrible little stream troll. And he tolerates me there. So, and I've been on his stream once to talk about a piece I did for Passage about IP law and monopoly capital. So and we've like collaborated in the past. So he asked me to come on, and I'm still I'm flattered but extremely baffled. And much like I am very flattered but extremely baffled that you would have me on. Thank you once again. I'm very confused by this. But I find it very charming and I appreciate it very much. So he had me on to just talk about the spectacle of American politics. And I, of course, love a spectacle. So I live for that kind of circus crap. So we were just, again, really not in my wheelhouse in terms of the actual things that I focus on for my work, but we talked about the insurrection and tried to put it in a global context and what it might mean for Canada, if anything, and just sort of how to interpret the course of events.
All right. Well, we actually have Rob Rousseau in the Twitter. We have Rob Rousseau in the Twitch chat right now. So.
Oh, fantastic.
Bit of a funny guest there, yeah. I've got to ask. I've been watching some of his streams recently. Basically, what are your thoughts on the hat? Are you hat in or hat out?
The hat?
What hat, Aiden?
He's been wearing an orange hat in streams recently.
Oh.
Are you hat in or hat out?
Oh, I thought this was some news thing that I didn't know about. I was about to be very embarrassed. I'm so sorry, Rob. I totally escaped my mind that he even had a hat.
Well, the thing with Rob is he's able to pull off almost anything. And
that's
so
true.
Whether he wears it or he doesn't, I think it's usually just like kind of warm and entertaining and a bit of a relief to listen to him talking. So I guess I'm hat in or hat off, depending on how Rob's feeling that day.
You know what? I think Rob is known as being a fashion icon around here. Mm-hmm. We're always talking about it. Mm-hmm. He's always in the news for his drip frequently. You can find him. Metro newspaper frequently has Rob Strip sort of on the front page. So
In Montreal, yeah.
Yeah, it's really a kind of like a cultural event every time he gets dressed. So
He's one of the better dressed men in NDG, which is the west side of town. But when he goes to the east side of town, he's one of the better dressed men over there. It's incredible. It's a Montreal thing, I guess.
It's sort of a pan Quebec thing, because I think anywhere he goes in this province, he's going to outshine. He's just sort of an icon of male fashion.
Oh, really good fit.
Yeah, that's what we know him for.
Mm-hmm.
Calgary's not really a fashion town. Calgary's about purchasing very expensive, obviously expensive looking fashion accessories and wearing them around town to show how much money you've made in oil and gas. Although that isn't so big anymore due to the huge downturn. So walking around downtown Calgary today, all the expensive like tie and suit stores seem to be having a really hard time.
Ooh.
Like a lot of vacant retail.
Mm-hmm.
Oof. Yeah. So I think Andre, basically you kind of froze up. Where were we with you both basically before you froze up?
Oh, there was a power surge and the internet dropped. I was about to start ranting about how frustrating it is that provincial governments know exactly what's going to happen, and they continue to do this weird trying to have it both ways thing when we absolutely know that the only solution is to go to zero COVID. For 6 weeks, people shut it down, and then we go to nothing. And then we get to be New Zealand, and we get to have live music in the summer or something. The only other option is this half-ass nonsense. And it's deeply frustrating because the governments across the country do not know what they're doing, and they've had 10 months to figure it out. And plenty of examples of what works to draw from.
I mean, for sure, like basically, like being an Ontarian is just maddening with Ford just bumbling around, like talking about how he's gonna go get a truck himself and go to America to get the vaccine. And it's just like, are you kidding me? Like, you idiot, you're the premier. You're the premier. Do something about it.
Yeah, folksiness is not what we need to handle pandemics.
Yeah.
We see the same thing in Quebec, right? With Premier Legault, who now has like a cult of personality behind him, and it's pretty fucked up because he has been terrible, and Quebec has been terrible with handling the pandemic. But I don't want to complain about it too much because there's nothing to be done about it, which is also really frustrating.
Well, in some senses, because most of the provinces in Canada right now have a conservative government in charge, you can really see the like pressure they face from like one of their key constituencies, which is like small business owners. And in a sense, like for small business owners, this has been like, particularly for a lot of the, I guess, like consumer facing small business, like restaurants and retail, this has been like pretty devastating because I know that like financial supports really aren't that great for them, but the governments don't want to like do full lockdowns for like 6 weeks to get to COVID zero because of this sort of influence this constituency within conservative movements has on the government. So like Kenny kept pointing out how long, when it took him so long to come down to a second lockdown in early December, was just constantly pointing out how he was afraid it would like ruin people's lives. And by people, he means small business owners, which has been like an interesting part of like discourse around the pandemic in general and how it impacts people, because we hear so much in the media about the impact it's having on small business owners, which is an impact that's happening, but it's never really talked so much about like what's happening to workers. Like a really great example was a news story, I think, in the Globe and Mail a couple of months ago about talking about mental health and people's mental health during this pandemic, which is obviously like very bad. And there's not a lot of support. And who do they go to get like a quote about like people having mental health problems? They go to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses for like a quote about like the mental health of small business owners. And like CFIB is like incredibly hostile to any kind of like increased like increased like benefits for workers with mental health. Like it could be like, more paid time off or something like that. And that's something CFIB is like really opposed to normally.
Well, it's also that no business is going to manage to turn a profit on 20% like attendance or whatever, like 20% of their previous business, which is going to be the average during a pandemic. So the only solution is to go to COVID zero, which is incredibly frustrating because they won't do it.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I guess one of the major things to discuss really is the news, basically that we may not have vaccines in Canada till I think it's mid 2022, right? So I guess basically we're in a trouble position. So I guess Andre, in terms of like basically the provincial government's just doing nothing and the federal government just doing nothing. Do you think there's a case for the federal government just trying to step in, just and certainly use its powers under the Emergency Act?
I think well, I think that's something that we didn't touch on yet, which is that the federal government have also been largely incompetent outside of the CERB rollout, which helped a lot of people. But besides that, they've basically been cowards. And Lana, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the reasons that the federal government won't step up and actually act like the government of the country is because they're playing politics. And so, for instance, in Quebec, they don't want to step on the toes of like just sort of provincial rights. So would you agree with that?
I would say that's probably like a piece of the puzzle is that it's probably some weird political subterfuge that they think they're doing 12D chess. I think the other part of the reason for it is that it is very much even to a certain extent, the emergency relief response, which was good, not effective enough, not universal enough, but good. Even that can be largely interpreted as mostly a handoff to landlords, since there was no rent freeze, there was no moratorium. There have still been evictions. Even in this city, there's been a pretty widespread uptick in evictions. So I think it's been a handoff to, it's an appeasement for small businesses because that's your organic base of like the people who are most likely to vote and be politically active. And we know what happens when middle-class white people don't get their barbecue. They go full race war is what it turns out. And I hate this country. It's so stupid. And I think the other thing besides it being sort of appeasement and a handoff to landlords is it's also a handoff to private corporations, that almost everything that's been done has been done with the full cooperation of some private business. I mean, I think the most obvious example was the PPE rollout, which was distributed, instead of doing it via Canada Post, they distributed it via Amazon, which is just sort of exemplary of what I'm talking about, is they're finding a way of, how do we respond to this in a way that's going to basically appease the people that we actually care about. So surplus populations like prisoners and old people in care homes don't really matter, but the people who are likely to actually turn up to vote for us or, get mad at us, then they're the ones who we actually care about appeasing, or who are, our donor base and are going to cut business ties with us or cut fundraising to us. That's what we care about. And so that's really been their priority the entire time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rory, is that how it looks on the west end of the country too?
Oh yeah, I mean, like, and the other thing too is that like part of this is like the jurisdictional football of who's going to pay for all of this, and so provinces are like very happy to try and kick that up the chain to the feds. I mean, the feds do have like more like financial capacity to do all these kinds of things, but the provinces will like often only do anything if the feds like entice them with some kind of money. Which has been like the paid sick leave, at least for COVID, has just been like in like kind of development hell for months now because of nobody really quite wants to pay for it. And also like in Alberta, we have the very classic tradition of blaming everything that goes wrong on the federal government, which is made really easy because there's another Trudeau in power. So like if Alberta's taking too long to distribute the vaccines we already have, guess whose fault that is? It's Trudeau, because he's not giving us vaccines fast enough or whatever. And with all kinds of other fun stuff like the Keystone XL cancellation, that's like,
I'm so sorry, by the way.
Yeah, so sorry, man. I don't know how you'll be able to bear it.
well, I
Yeah,
mean,
that's too bad.
I own like 4.2 millionth of that pipeline, thanks to
What a loss.
thanks to the $1.5 billion we put into it, plus another $6 billion in loan guarantees that we don't know if we're getting that back.
Well, it's like the I told Aiden that I wanted to complain about asymmetrical federalism because it never struck me how shitty it was until this pandemic, because it just doesn't work. It doesn't work like as a country when you actually have to deal with a major problem like this. So we're not seeing a national approach to any of the crises that we're dealing with right now as a like so-called like as a country, and that can't change unless the federal government wanted to step up, which I don't think they're capable of doing. And this was really frustrating me today. And then something even worse happened, which is that I realized I've been washing my beard with dog food, and I hadn't looked at the can that I'd been using because I use canned shampoo, and it was just dog food. For months now I've been doing this, and so that was a real shock, and it really surprised me. Lane, have you ever done anything like that? Has that ever happened to you?
Well, since
I'm so happy that this happened today.
Yeah, it's a coincidence because it happened to who's that really famous amazing pundit? What's his name? Barbara Kay. Jonathan Kay.
Barbara Kay's little boy.
Her little boy. He so by the way, this is definitely a John Kay brewed, like he brewed up a psyop, right? He wrote himself into being Twitter's leading man for the day. Is that what happened?
I want to believe, as a pro wrestling fan, that was a work, a genius work that none of us understood.
Okay.
But so, I mean, I don't know if you know what that means, but a work is basically just in wrestling when they come up with a story and it's not real life, they pretend that they're fighting. People on Twitter are doing bits all the time. They're constantly working you. It comes from the circus. It's the idea of you work somebody out of their money. You know, you work somebody into paying you to put on a show. What does he get though out of working people on Twitter? He gets clout. That's the currency. And does John Kay need this kind of clout? I think John Kay is he a smart man? No. But I think he's made the calculation that he's not going to earn people's respect, but what he can get is your attention.
Exactly.
So he has that going for him. And as a circus performer myself, I understand that. But did he come up with this bit? I think it speaks volumes to who John Kay is as a public figure, that even if it was a work, nobody believes him.
Yeah, right.
Well, also earning people's contempt is very useful for like the political role that John Kay plays in Canadian media, which is like being able to point out like, look at this, the evil left wingers who just like constantly insult me. Because he had something the other day about how he preferred the sort of open like anti-Semitism of the right than leftists saying like, oh, you shouldn't say bad things about other like cultures. And that somehow it's like dishonest for leftists to say that when really they should just like openly say we hate him. And like honestly, yes, leftists should just but we actually look at his replies to his tweets, like people who are definitely left wingers just like shitting on him. Like there's no like beating around the bush or being dishonest. They're just like, I fucking hate you.
I mean, I do think that because you're right, ultimately that is the right-wing media ecosystem is just generating as much outrage over like drummed up culture war bullshit as they can come up with. And they have deep pockets and a lot of time on their hands. So they constantly are just spinning yarns about all kinds of stuff for you to get mad at. They don't even care if it's true or not. They just want you to react. It's absolute carnival-esque spectacle just to waste your time and make you upset. and that's how they generate. I mean, for their base of people, small number of deep-pocketed people who like that stuff, I mean, it always works, you know. It's like the PragerU way of doing things, where they'll just say whatever. They'll just throw anything at a wall, and they know it's mostly BS. They know it's mostly made up, but they're doing it because they know it's going to get a reaction. And then every single person who actually supports their ideological project can look at that and go, "Ha ha, triggered the libs." Mm-hmm. But with John Kay, it is so easy to do that by just, like what you said, just doing like Nazi apologia or something. It's so easy to do that. I can do that when I'm in the bathroom tweeting on my phone. It's the easiest thing in the world. So the fact that if he did hatch this little bit of his, why he settled on dog shampoo and why he thought that that would be a really funny way to work people up is astonishing psychologically.
I want to. This is so interesting, your analysis, and it makes a lot of sense because I don't understand things, I think, as highly as you do about the way the system functions with like Twitter outrage and clout and stuff. But for me, I subscribed, unfortunately, and it was an accident, to the Walrus for the 2 of the years that he was the editor-in-chief. Actually, my mother got me this subscription for my birthday. Okay, but so I was reading it like under his leadership, and it wasn't a great magazine. Like, it was definitely different from how it was when it was initially launched in its early years. But he had like a end of magazine column that was published every month, and that's where I kind of got to know him as like a person who sounded like he thought he was clever. But this was also before he had taken a public heel turn, which I think he really has clearly in the last 4, 5, 6 years. No coincidence, after he lost his Walrus like prestige kind of position, because he's nothing if not like a Toronto elite grifter, right? Or more like a English Canada, like Central Canada elite grifter. Because I believe I learned from one of his columns in the Walrus that he went to high school at a Montreal prep high school in the West End. So anyways, I find him kind of fascinating, but he is like deeply disgusting, just because all his perspectives are like really mean, cruel, and small-minded.
Well, I think he's worked on that, like, and it's like very interesting how he like goes on and on about how like there's like a particular kind of like woke elite that is like keeping out all the sort of man in the streets like unwoke opinions. Yet this guy is like very much part of the elite, in certainly the media elite in Canada. He's like also like a perfect encapsulation of like why we don't live in a meritocracy, because he got a job because his mom was a columnist, and also like the kind of political opinions he holds is like very useful to those who own the media in Canada, which is like conservative right-wing US hedge funds. So like this is like very useful, like his opinions are like very useful for that, because he still gets like somewhat semi-regular op-eds in Post Media. But yeah, like and so much of like this stuff is like coming out of people who are like very much part of like Canada's like elite media ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. Did you hear I think there were some shouts on the National Post about Don Cherry becoming the Governor General. So like I think that's pick. That.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, fuck the monarchy. Put that guy in charge of the monarchy in Canada, and we would get rid of it in like 2 years.
Fine, make Don Cherry the Governor General. Who cares anymore? It's fucking clown country.
I'm just like imagining him like not showing up to an event because like Trudeau's like worn a shirt that Don Cherry considers too effeminate or something.
That can't possibly be true.
did someone really put his name out as a trial balloon? I mean, well, yeah, of course somebody did. In the
Rebel
National
Media
Post,
was
right?
running a petition on it.
Oh,
to
really?
Like, well, obviously it's everything they do is just basically a grift to like figure out how to get more money out of the people who watch Rebel Media, but they were certainly running a petition about it.
Kay and Rebel Media, classic Canadian grifts, and you really have to hand it to them.
Yeah, for sure. But now oh, sorry, Rory, go ahead.
Oh, well, it's just going to say, like, running a right-wing media operation in this country must be, like, so easy, because there's always, like, particularly, like, somewhat wealthy people who will just give you money to, like, go publish nonsense.
I am so convinced that we have some kind of underground lab where we're just like producing right-wing shitheads in a pod or something, and then when they're like mature enough, we export them to America, and they
We
just
have that-
wreak havoc.
It's called the University Campus Conservative.
Yeah, right.
In Calgary, we have that. Basically, there's a pipeline, not quite for oil, but for like people who love oil, from the University of Calgary straight into the Manning Center, and that's where they train them up into becoming, like media talking heads, political staffers, and in many cases, eventually like elected officials. So that's sort of Calgary has a very, very important role in creating like Canada's conservative movement.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of money that's been spent over the decades to like create this and like nurture it and build it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we're being less surprised now about far right voices coming out of Canada, because it's like how, popular comedians only get popular when they move to the States, and it's kind of the same with like Gavin McInnes had to really break in the States before he got to found a brown shirt movement to go attack the Capitol. But I still get baffled because he used to just be like an annoying, too cool for you hipster in Montreal in like the late 90s, probably shooting heroin in fucking Cinema L'Amour on Saint Laurent, which is the oldest porn theater in North America, an old vaudeville theater, I believe. Thumbs up. I never got to go inside before the pandemic, unfortunately. But what's my point? My point is he would go there and hang out when he was supposed to be working at the Vice offices, and then he opened up a completely an insanely lame fascist movement in the United States. It's insane.
The idea of like a shitty rich hipster guy pretending to be poor as a LARP and then like pivoting far right is not the wildest thing I've ever heard.
In the history,
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
right. In the history of fascism, that was actually like not that uncommon. Like in the 20s and 30s, there were people who did that sort of bit where they were kind of like a bohemian and then kind of pivoted into the far right.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Alberta Advantage actually did I have to give credit to y'all over there. They did a really good podcast on the history of the Ku Klux Klan in the province, and so yeah, it's a definitely a good shout that you mentioned that. But talking about podcasts, and we've talked a lot about right-wing talking heads, media figures. There's a left-wing group that's working to combat the mainstreaming of the right wing. Andre, I feel like you know a thing or two about that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, let me plug Harbinger Media. So it's just a collection of some of the left podcasts in the country, including Alberta Advantage, like I mentioned at the outset of this stream. And the idea is basically that when, like, Alberta Advantage is a huge show by left podcast standards and by Canadian left podcast standards. And some other shows are big on the network, but the idea is that by coming together, we get to be bigger by creating a community and by supporting each other and by signal boosting each other and sharing skills and sharing, other things. And so the idea is basically just to try to create like an alternative pole where we can be creating different kinds of discourse and hosting the kinds of conversations that like you're not going to see obviously in the mainstream, but even in the sort of like liberal podcast sphere. I won't name names, but like ideology and like socialism specifically is not really something that media stands for in this country, but socialism is good. It's something that we need, and it's something that I think basically that's what the shows have in common, is that everybody's essentially a socialist or a Marxist. Rory, I know there's lots of Marxists at Alberta Advantage, and so it's basically an effort to create a sort of unified presence of a bunch of people who basically believe in a lot of the same things to try to create alternative discourse in this fake country.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'll definitely say before Rory will jump in that I've definitely enjoyed that a ton course, a little plug for the Canada Files podcast, Canadian Foreign Policy Files. If any of you hadn't gotten a chance to listen to that before, certainly it's Canadian foreign policy and such. It's not the focus of this one, but if you enjoy that focus, you want it from the left. Got Yvonne Glaire and Arnold August, who are two people who have way more experience than me in the foreign policy field. But it's always fun to chat with them and kind of have a range of ideas there. So definitely go check that out. But Rory, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the origins of the Alberta Advantage were because of like our frustration with the lack of any kind of dissenting voices in the media, that it runs the gamut. The Canadian mainstream media runs the gamut from basically like center to harder right. And there's like very little, like even like opinion columnists or talking heads who are like consistently like social democrats on, and you don't see a lot of that in mainstream Canadian media, which is like kind of like nuts in the sense that there has been like historically a social democratic party that has won government in Canada, like on a provincial level. And then there's like very little of the media like even reflects like that opinion, even though it's like a sort of sizable political constituency. I mean, Canadian media is just like owned by conservatives and staffed by liberals.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And there's an anecdote I probably haven't shared at all yet, but I'll share it for context. Because I mean, like I'm not with the NDP anymore, but I was with them basically in like 2019. And obviously I volunteered on I was head of comms for Naima Farah's campaign to go north. Great person, might even have her on the show at some point. But one of the things I was thinking about basically at that time was starting a NDP kind of like centric podcast basically at the time, and that never got going because there was never the interest. And obviously I'm not even in the party anymore, but I mean I'm glad to see basically first of all the Harbinger Network, there's a lot of them I just get to learn about, but also I'm just glad to see that there's a general stronger sense of unity there on with the online left, which is, it's obviously important to translate that into real life action, but it's great to see that, because like when I kind of floated that around at the time, there wasn't really much interest. And so see how things have changed, it's definitely for the better. So.
And I think, like, I don't know how the rest of you see sort of the role of left, like extremely online left. But I think that in the case of like Alberta Advantage, it's as they're educators, right? Primarily Alberta Advantage is an educational tool, which is so fantastic. And then sometimes other people are like sort of influencer slash entertainer slash educator, and those things can be happening all at the same time. And that's important because a lot of people spend a lot of their time online, and disseminating ideas through where people are at is really important. So I mean, I think it's exciting just because old media is obviously dead, but just not like buried yet. So we're trying to build some, who knows what it'll eventually become. But one thing is that just making space for, everybody to kind of be together, I think is really important. So that's what I think Harbinger tries to do. You guys, I gotta go. I wish I could stay longer, but I have a thing. So this has been really cool. I'd like to have each of you guys come on the Harbinger Society Presents sometime to sit on a panel and just like continue these sorts of topics for conversation. That'd be really nice. And Aidan, I'm so happy that you invited this trio, because these guys are so fun to talk to, and I had a lot of fun. This has been really cool.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on. Basically,
great to chat with you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna say until next time. And I hope you guys have a good rest of your conversation. And I'm going to hang up, and I'll catch you later. And John K is my dad. Okay, see you guys.
He's all our dads.
Bye.
Yeah, he's all our sons too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I can sort of at least speak to what it means to operate as a media personality online, since that's kind of what I am, reluctantly. I guess, I mean, like, I come at it from, there's nothing better than real organizing, and there's no amount of, I mean, educational work and political inoculation and all that is super important. And I think it's a big piece of the puzzle in terms of like raising not just people's awareness, but their actual level of political activation and motivation to actually go and like do something. But it comes back to, I mean, like, this is a question that people have been grappling with for over 100 years. You know, can a newspaper be a revolutionary organ? And like it can, but it can if it's tied to an actual mobilized organizing effort, some kind of workers' party or union or something that it's acting on behalf of to actually gently nudge people into. So if you are like, I think Alberta Advantage is a really great show because it's super educational and everybody in it has really good organizing bona fides, and it actually lets you know what's going on and gives you a nice context for understand the work that people are doing and how to get involved. And I mean, I can't really speak to that because my show isn't a politics show. I'm not really a politics writer. I'm an art critic, and I've always been an art critic. I don't hide my politics. I wear them on my sleeve, and for me, it's really important because people spend so much of their time kind of passively consuming media and very little time thinking about the elements of cultural production and the actual industrial process behind how that media gets made and who's funding it and who are the producers of it and how they're being treated. And, you know, there's an entire industrial framework behind, and there's an entire ideological apparatus behind the media that people consume on a regular basis. And so it has this really important but kind of intangible use value of not, I don't think it's like you watch a piece of problematic media and then it puts the devil in you and you're going to do something bad, or like it makes you into a communist or something. You know, by contrast, you know, you can't watch the good media and become a communist and watch the bad media and become a fascist. I don't think it works like that. But it does have a worldview setting value. It does color how people interpret the world around them. It does have an impact on how people view history and their role in it. And it also has, you know, it's a vehicle for propaganda for the forces in society that actually own, whether it's the news media, whether it's entertainment, whether it's social media. These are all private platforms that have a really insidious relationship with the state, which we've been seeing happen pretty recently with the big tech discourse that just happened in the wake of the insurrection. So I do think it's really important to try to like create a political understanding or have a political economy of cultural production and understand how those things impact one another. And so that's sort of where I come down on it as an art critic. I think having those networks available are super important, but preferably if you aren't tying that back to some real active political engagement, it's just talking. It's nice. It can be really illuminating and very edifying, but it's just talking. So if it's backed by something real and there's a real mass movement behind it, I think that's the thing that's really going to move the dial. And everything else is like recruitment, awareness building, inoculation, and analysis, which is valuable. It's super valuable to have that, but it's one piece of a very big puzzle that I think that the left has got to kind of solve, because we are in a pretty weakened condition overall internationally. And there's a lot of catch up that we have to do because we have been deliberately dismantled. It's not that we died, we were murdered. I mean that quite literally. And so we have to, and the forces against us are, and the control that they have over cultural production and narrative setting are incredibly vast. And so we have a lot of work to do in terms of using the tools as they kind of exist, and to the extent that we can access them to kind of catch up with that. So that's where I come down on it.
For sure. And one of the interesting things, I can speak to this in a bit of a different perspective, because I came from kind of activism and like student organizing per se, like in terms of, obviously probably know the education cuts. There's a main like kind of group that opposed the education cuts, and then also I kind of co-founded and ran one called Students Against Public Education Cuts. And so basically I came in from like the student organizing experience, the anti-cuts experience, and basically so coming into like the journalism field, coming onto the very online field was basically a bit of a funny thing for me at first, because basically like pre-pandemic, most of my brain was still like, I had like the kind of organizer activist brain more, and it's like the pandemic has turned me into the had that shift where I've become like the very online kind of writer person and stuff, because well, there's not too much else to do. uh but basically, yeah, it's one of the funniest things there, basically, just coming from the opposite perspective. It's rather interesting. So Rory, were you gonna jump in?
Yeah, I mean, what Lana said was really excellent, and I think that any kind of like media or educational project, like the end goal ultimately is like some kind of like real world organizing is what it should point to, but also like how the left being in a very weak state means that like often you do have like a head without a body sort of thing where there's all kinds of people like producing content and analysis and educational material, and there's not really like the mass movement to plug into. And this is kind of like doubly the issue in Alberta, because like one of the ways that like certainly like media interacts with in Alberta is that like people in this province aren't necessarily like right wing per se. Like it's more that everyone here has like this sort of like collective political brain injury from like decades of oil industry propaganda, and that's like very hard to get over. So that talking about pipelines in Alberta, like everyone just sort of accepts it as like received wisdom that pipelines are good. Alberta needs pipelines, even though like most people like have no real material interest, like there'll be no real material benefit to them for pipelines. Yet the media repeats to them, these pipelines are important to Alberta. They're worth this many billions of dollars. They might, this many hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil are going to go through it every day. And people just sort of accept that's what we need. And there's like very little like sort of pushback on that, and like explanation that like, no, this is like more complex, that the public interest is not the same as the oil industry's interest. And when you see like sort of like political alternatives to the Conservatives, you get the Alberta NDP, which is more or less like, we should not give the oil companies tax cuts, but we should still be building pipelines. And in fact, we're going to build these pipelines by like with the Trans Mountain pipeline, it's going to be the federal government is going to like pump billions of dollars of taxpayer money into building this thing. So I don't know. It's like, it's a weird chicken and egg problem where we have like all media, but not, we have like some media and we're still like very much on the margins, but also like not really like mass organizations that can quite point to. So it,
Yeah, for sure. I guess I want to ask, since we're kind of like on a podcast focused front now, and kind of the organizing versus like online kind of perspective. So I guess for you, and I guess for the rest of the Alberta Advantage team, where were you all coming from? Were you the very online people that just started a podcast, or was it more organizing and, hey, we want to do a podcast?
so actually we came out of a reading group. So a bunch of us met basically back in the end of like 2014, where we started like a Jacobin reading group, and just met in a pub every week for years. And then we kind of like decided to put what we'd read into like creating a podcast to like analyze stuff, because we started reading a lot about like kind of the regional political economy of Western Canada, and like, wow, like this explains like so much like why all of this is like fucked up. So that's kind of our background, in the sense that like, yeah, a lot of us are online and get all the Twitter jokes, but one of the things we wanted to avoid was like being a podcast. It's like talking about the goings on Twitter, which is like fine, but that wasn't really what we wanted to do. We wanted to talk more. We want to like kind of try and reach out to people who don't necessarily spend a lot of time online, and to try and like explain to them like why the province is this way and like why it doesn't have to be. So, I mean, in some senses, that the reading group is also like explains like why we have like a pretty consistent collective a worldview about things because we've read a lot of the same material and have like the same kind of foundational perspectives.
For sure. And I have to give special thanks to your podcast because obviously I was aware of Abram Lutz before, but it was I think it was his appearance on basically your podcast about New Brunswick and the whole basically waffle movement there that kind of, I think basically really did kind of basically make me realize how much of a like an interesting kind of figure he is. So, like, you've done a ton of great work like bringing on some really interesting figures. Now I think I might have actually had him on the news stream before, but still, like, you guys bring on some pretty special people. So I can't praise you. I can't praise the work y'all do enough. So.
Well, honestly, a lot of it is just like asking people. Sometimes people will ask us, and probably more often we ask other people. Usually, like we'll like ask academics or like writers and that sort of stuff to come on and talk about something that they know about, which is like handy.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess shifting gears now, basically, I think we all know, and I think basically, I think a lot of Canadians know about this. So, the Falun Gong-backed Epoch Times, the Admiral quote unquote newspaper, has been going around. I'm guessing you two are big fans, right?
I just love dance. I just love choreography.
I'm a big cult fan too, you know. They're really great.
So I haven't received this newspaper because I have a no flyers sticker on my box, which also means I miss out on like all the A&W coupons. But anyway, but fun, interesting stuff about Falun Gong. Like what was it? They have, so you know their song and dance show that they do. So they haven't hosted it. There's two big like kind of like multimedia presentation centers in Alberta. There's the Southern Alberta Jubilee Theatre and the Northern Alberta Jubilee Theatre in Calgary and Edmonton, respectively. And that's where they host like Calgary and Edmonton Opera and they do concerts and stuff there. So basically, Falun Gong became convinced. They were trying to meet with the Minister of Culture about that there were safety rule regulation changes that said that above the orchestra pit there had to be a net to ensure that like performers, if they fell, they wouldn't be injured or they wouldn't injure anyone down there. So Falun Gong became like very concerned that this was actually the Chinese government had leaned on the Alberta provincial government to put this in there to ensure that Falun Gong wouldn't perform, because Falun Gong like refused to use a safety net because it like took some of the daring out of the art of their like anti-communist song and dance show. So they wouldn't, they like boycotted playing there, but that they believed this was because of the Chinese government's influence, when it was just literally a safety regulation.
Well, don't they?
Nuts.
Yes.
I recall that there was a pretty good expose about them not that long ago, where it talked about the sort of cult-like indoctrination practices that were basically just torture. Like the way that they train people to dance is through the kind of like chanting that you would associate with like cult indoctrination, forced sleep deprivation, just all of these like weird practices to keep people like working and practicing at for really like inhuman stretches of time, to the point where they're like mentally and physically broken down. Like it's actually a really aggressively oppressive company to work for or to be involved in as a dancer. It's actually like an incredibly abusive and exploitative environment. And I think that's so much of the mystification around what Falun Gong is this sort of like semi-religious kind of spiritual cultural revival cult. At the end of the day, they're a business too. And they're a business that operates a certain way and treats its dancers a certain way. And they don't want any state intervention to, stop them from engaging in that kind of exploitation. So that's really, I think, what it comes down to in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah, and I mean, see, they also receive basically the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which I mean, I suppose basically isn't technically surprising, but at the same time, I mean, funding the Falun Gong is not great. I mean, Daniel Z did a piece for the Canada Files, and I just want to read out some of the teachings out there, and I can put the link below. First of all, the belief that the world has been destroyed 81 times in the past, with the current age of human existence being the final time of the final apocalypse. A cult of personality positioning Li Hongzhi as a messiah who can stop the world from being destroyed yet again. Falun Gong teachings also posit that Li is the highest Buddha. They are opposed to the use of medicine to treat diseases, claiming that diseases can be simply gotten rid of if one expels bad karma from their body. The death associated from the school of thought were the Chinese government's reason for moving against Falun Gong. And also, they posit Falun Dafa as the only acceptable religion, and all other religions as quote unquote fermenting division among humanity. So basically, this is like a genuinely dangerous group here, right? And they also had like links to the Capitol Hill. The Capitol Hill basically invasion there. There is Falun Gong people there. Basically, there's a whole network of them building support among these right-wing, basically Trump supporters, parroting false claims of election fraud. Like, these are genuinely dangerous people that are like, they're getting cited by like, they're being given like huge New York Times op-eds to spread propaganda. Like, it's just like, you think of the China virus, like that really racist claim, like, and all of these kind of just nonsensical. It really is nonsense, right? And so it's just insane to me there.
Yeah, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that they're fascists. I mean, in terms of what their actual political ambitions are, they're violent, anti-communist, religious ideologues, who represent a specific set of class interests too. And I think that like it's not over the top. And I think a lot of people don't really recognize what they are as being fascist, because I think people associate fascism not with a political project or ideology with certain criteria. I think that a lot of people associate it with a kind of aesthetic. Like, you're not a fascist unless you like are a skinhead with a giant swastika tattoo. Like, unless you are wearing an SS uniform, like, you're not a Nazi. And I think part of it is cultural ignorance, lack of understanding of who these people are, and what where they come from and what they're trying to accomplish. And I think a lot of it is also just plain Orientalism, and people being easily taken in by like mystical Asian narratives. Even though, like, for example, the kind of dance that the Falun Gong performs is classical Chinese dance, which is a modern invention. They claim it goes back 5,000 years or whatever. It's a modern invention that was created in the 1950s by communists. It was a state project. And then they adopted some version of it that they claimed was traditional folk dance. So it's all of this spiritualist stuff. It's a mystification process for a core political project that is extremely right-wing, violently anti-communist, and incredibly racist and very, very dangerous. And as goofy as it is, I think it does need to be taken seriously. And I think it does need to be taken seriously that a lot of people in the West just kind of lack the context for understanding what these people are. And because of their own xenophobia and their own Orientalism, are easily persuaded by certain aesthetic tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, it's Falun Gong's like more obvious turn towards like far right politics. It's like dovetailed very nicely with the like Trump administration and the Trump administration's like kind of ratcheting up the Cold War with China. And then, of course, with coronavirus, that's been like very useful to like, trying to like create like a popular anti-China sentiment. I mean, the other thing too, like these things are like paid for with public money to an extent. Like, how much money does it cost to send a newspaper to every single residential address in Canada for free. Like, you know, you're not paying for this. I mean, well, I mean, we're not paying for it directly, but I know that like during the Harper government era, the federal government gave money to Falun Gong's media outlets through like ethnic media funds. The U.S. almost certainly gives money to Falun Gong because it's a useful part of like their foreign policy to like bother the Chinese with. But and it's also like very interesting in the context of Canada and like Canada's like weird stuff around like pipelines and things, because like the reason why we have to build all these pipelines to like over the Rockies or whatever is like, who's going to buy that oil? Well, it's China, but also China is bad, and there's like this contradiction in it. And particularly here in Alberta, where you get like Kenny is like willing to indulge in like elements of like anti-China stuff, and certainly like the harder right in Alberta has like makes use of like, you know, the China virus, et cetera, but like China's also like where we want to sell all that oil to.
Yeah, I think that like that's a really important contradiction that you can like kind of resolve when, so my friend put this a really interesting way where he said China isn't the enemy so much as China is the prize. Other imperial countries are the opponents. And what's really kind of what they're, or rather it would be better to say that the CCP are opponents, China is the prize. And so yes, insofar as, you know, we have these ongoing business relationships with them, they hold an awful lot of our debt. A lot of their real estate firms operate here and build condos. A lot of their energy firms operate here and have investments in energy infrastructure projects. And there's a lot of on the ground hostility from people who live in like Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver, who when they talk, like there are a lot of people who will conflate genuine grievances that they have with like whoever owns like the company that owns their condo or whatever, with China and the Chinese government. And they'll, you know, talk about these foreign investors in this very uncomfortable way. And so if you understand like where that antagonism comes from, it kind of makes sense when you see painting the CCP as this like tyrannical enemy, because the purpose of which is to get them out of the way. Because what's fundamentally happening is that the government or the ruling class here isn't so much angry that we have business dealings with China. What they're annoyed about is that they have to deal with Chinese state regulations, and they don't have a certain degree of control over what China does with that revenue. And the projects that they invest in at home and abroad, say in Africa, where they do all kinds of infrastructure projects. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is they're trying to get the CCP out of the way and install comprador government that'll be favorable to them, and will give capitalists that are operating, say, factories in that country a certain degree of control over how much they can exploit people. Which now they have to adhere to certain regulations, and they can actually be fined or go to jail, or in certain extreme circumstances even be executed, for example, for engaging in slave labor.
Yeah, actually, I think there's a Chinese banker that was recently executed for basically bribery and corruption. And I mean, like, if you had that level of basically stringency over that, I mean, I think society's better. I think society's better off when the basically people that have that money are scared shitless of doing anything wrong. They should be.
Yeah, well, like that's the whole recent thing where everybody for like 2 weeks, Jack Ma like just wasn't around. So there was this whole online conspiracy theory that grew up around, oh, well, they've imprisoned Jack Ma, they've secretly killed Jack Ma. And then he turned up like 2 weeks later, who the hell knows where he's been. But like that's the idea that we're supposed to have this degree of concern because like China might have imprisoned some billionaire, and to create a kind of like cult of personality around this guy, like, oh, it's the lovable Jack Ma, the horrible Chinese government has done something to him. And so like that is, I think that really kind of exposes a lot about like the ruling class ideology in terms of who they consider to be untenable political prisoners and who they don't. We're supposed to care about people like Navalny and Jack Ma, but like we're not really supposed to care, you know, every single time we perform a coup in Latin America, which is we're always supposed to support, you know? So we're okay with some political prisoners, but not others. And it's very revealing who the media decides we're supposed to care about.
It's interesting as well with China, because like obviously like China has the prize, but China isn't in the sort of like global hierarchy of, you know, where a country is like in the core periphery. Like China's like unarguably like one of the great powers, like, and will probably surpass the United States soon. So like the idea that it's not, I guess it's like not merely like uh you know, a Latin American country that you can bully around very easily, but instead has like, you know, a giant military and can like compete globally. Like how China has like never really been part of like the Washington consensus for like neoliberal economics, and they can just not be part of it and not be punished, because like that's like one of the things about like you want to like do like, you know, an experiment, an economic experiment in like socialist economics in Latin America, like be prepared to have like the world market and like other capitalist great powers like fuck around with your economy and make shit go haywire. But like when you're China, like other countries can't really do that to you. And if they try, like besides the fact that China has the ability to retaliate, like as we've seen with the trade war between the United States and China, but also that because China's economy is also like very plugged into the global economy, it's like difficult to do it in a way that doesn't have like so much like economic blowback.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, basically, it's not like they haven't tried. Like, you think of like the Five Eyes, for example, which, I mean, I wrote about it. They obviously, they actually worked very hard behind the scenes along with the Canadian military. And I mean, I hate giving any credit to Rebel Media, but Rebel Media did the FOIA, which obviously they took a different angle on. But basically, it revealed that our government basically was blocking military cooperation with China, basically. And also, like, you think of basically, and obviously that's not, I guess, as massive in the great scale, even though it's yet another way of us just sabotaging an important relationship there, is as well basically in terms of Huawei. I think Huawei is the number one, like, think of the Canada, China, the domestic link. It really is Huawei. And I guess specifically just in terms of basically them being able to engage in the 5G networks. Basically, our federal government has been really nothing but Five Eyes lackeys, really. Basically, pushing to the point where they just delayed and delayed and delayed, right? So basically, as a result, Huawei actually just got basically squeezed out of any of the 5G deals. So yeah, we obviously we have so many domestic linkages to China there for sure. But I think I wanted to get to a point in terms of basically the back to the Epoch Times is basically two workers, actually two very brave workers. I believe they're in Regina. It was a CBC story I did a video based off of for the Canada Files, but they actually refused to deliver the Epoch Times newspaper, and they got temporarily suspended. Basically, like the federal government, right? It has power to stop it being distributed, but instead, it takes these workers being just crushed. Like, for example, and it's really gross. I guess I would ask in terms of like thoughts in terms of like worker power, like Canada Post. I mean, there's so much to talk about Canada and the federal government and the Canada Post. So I guess I'll just you two both have your mics on, so I'm gonna let you go.
Well, I mean, I guess like generally like the idea of like Canada Post is of course supposed to be like a sort of neutral carrier of mail, so that generally like postal workers aren't supposed to be able to uh, refuse to deliver things, because you know that can get into all kinds of stuff. So that generally like when Canada Post refuses to carry to like deliver something, it's because something's been like specifically banned. Like I've seen it, like it's been done with like some like far right propaganda and that sort of thing. But I mean, like the Epic Times is definitely that, and it's like also like very unusual, like particularly in the context where we've seen like all of this like hand wringing over like, you know, Russian influence on like Western politics, and like the sort of like alt-right, like, you know, screwing up like the media ecosystem and discourse, and like that also the federal government isn't like really willing to like be concerned about like the delivery of this newspaper, and like particularly like that like it's like full of a lot of stuff that's like just like not like that doesn't like even like meet the standards of like our normal like post media garbage. So like, it's like much further than that. So like the federal government's like not really taking like a position on it. So it leaves like workers out in the lurch who like at Canada Post decide like this is not something that should be delivered into people's houses in like this day and age of like just like all this like political upheaval and that sort of thing. So I mean, certainly solidarity with them.
Yeah, I mean, it is really unexpected that they would do that. Just because I still get it. I still get the Epoch Times. I usually just throw it out when I do. But yeah, I mean, it's always one of those things where it starts to become like the sort of like left libertarian type of people will say, well, if you start doing that, then who's to say what, you know, the post office being a public, you know, state institution, who's to say who they'll censor next? And I think that it would be like a misreading of the situation, but I can kind of foresee that argument happening. But I think that in this case, it was very clearly the case where the rank and file themselves made a decision that, you know, this stuff is dangerous propaganda. It's full of lies, and it shouldn't be disseminated. And it's a question of who has power, because at the end of the day, there's no real such thing as absolute free speech. And, you know, whoever is sort of in charge of like setting the acceptable terms of debate or whatever, the acceptable terms of conversation, that's always an exercise of power. And it's, if you look at, you know, the left, and we just talked about like the left-wing media ecosystem, even in this country, is pretty weak and beaten down. And there are all these sorts of formal and informal and implicit mechanisms for suppressing it, just sort of keeping people out of the media. And so there's right-wing propaganda surrounding us constantly, even in the mainstream. Of course, usually that's more moderated, but it's still nonetheless majority center right, like at best. And that's constantly what we're bombarded with. And I don't think a lot of people really recognize how constant the right-wing media machine in this country is. Like, it's constantly functioning, and it's constantly just this hegemonic ideological force in this country. And so I think a lot of people think we live in this sort of like neutral free speech zone, when the terms of debate are already pretty much decided, and the terms of acceptable political boundary is already pretty much decided. And so to have I think that having organized labor exercise itself not just as a material force against capital and against the bosses, but also as a political force against the larger reactionary forces in society, is an incredibly valuable thing to do. And that might go against whatever the democratic consensus is currently in this country in terms of, you know, is it acceptable to suppress this or that newspaper? But it's also worthwhile in terms of getting people to recognize, you know, we as a community, we as a society have a certain obligation to each other not to spread dangerous crap. And we have to make decisions about what information we consider to be truthful and acceptable and what we don't. And just as the ruling class exercises that power over time about what to tell and not tell people, we also have to exercise a certain degree of discretion with how we consume media and how we and what stuff we promote and what stuff we don't. And through organized labor, you can actually demonstrate the utility of you know, actually making those distinctions and making those decisions. And that's far more democratic than what we have now, even if we think it's not.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, to speak to the extent of the right-wing hegemony, like, for me, I remember basically being in high school, the edge of high school. I remember having to actively like consciously work over like weeks and months of time to find news sources and kind of find these left news sources. Like it was an active effort to find these kind of things, and even then, right, I wasn't able to find very much at the time, basically. So that was like one of the reasons why the Can Files got started originally. It was because I just didn't know where else I could go. Like I just didn't feel like there's anywhere else to go. And like over time, I realized, oh, hey, there's some of these other sites which are, I find a lot of them are social democratic. There's some that are socialist or some that are more like genuine left there. But yeah, it was like the audience penetration, I guess is the way I'd put it. It was just, obviously it's not really in their control so much because it's just the algorithm, and the media landscape generally is quite literally rigged against them per se. But yeah, I mean, like basically, even for someone who's actively seeking out these kind of things, at the time it was really difficult for me. And so basically, like that's basically, if I had known basically about more left media, who knows, maybe the Can Files isn't a thing and I might just have gone to go for other stuff. But I mean, I'm happy that I ended up starting this, but who knows, things could have really changed if I had known something earlier than I did. So
Yeah, I mean, and not even just in terms of what the boundaries are for ideology and in terms of political analysis, but even just basic facts are suppressed because objectively they lead to certain conclusions that are undesirable. Like I remember in high school, and like this is something that it's not just news media, it's not just social media, it's every bit of education and socialization in our society is oriented this way. And so much of it is just through sheer ignorance and just through lack of resources, deliberate lack of resources, deliberate lack of training. I remember my like grade 10 history teacher was also my music teacher. And he wasn't, I mean, he taught out of the textbook. And the textbook is basically just what you would expect, is just this sort of watered down great man theory stuff, the kind of boilerplate storybook Canadian history that we tell people. And I recall talking to him. I remember mentioning the Duplessis orphans to him, which at the time I was just learning about, and it was one of those like pre-communist, like I'm almost on the verge of becoming radicalized type of things, where it's like you learn this for the first time and it kind of shatters your illusions. So I had learned about this, and I was like 16, and this man had to be in at least his 30s. He had never heard of it. I had to bring that information to him. He didn't believe me when I told him. I had to like print out the information because we did that in those days. And like give him a stack of resources and be like, no, this is a real thing that happened. You know, so a lot of this, it's not even just the terms of the debate that are curtailed. It's just basic facts about the world. Yeah.
It really is. And I mean, like, I can speak also to my experience with history. Like, for example, in terms of the genocide against Indigenous peoples, the teaching of it in high school was a joke. It was a joke. Basically, I had to figure, it was one of those things where I had to slowly try to educate myself to like a decent level, basically through my own efforts there, because we basically just got taught that, oh, some bad things happened and we're here and, you know, we're moving on and it's fine. Like that was like our definition in terms of basically relations and such, and genocide against Indigenous nations, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was the first part that was an absolute joke. And then also, right, and things that I've only learned about recently in terms of like you think of like the Upper Canada, Lower Canada rebellions in the past, right? You think of the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919, like these kind of efforts of resistance against the state, which is obviously different inherently in nature, but these kind of like efforts of resistance are just, they don't exist, right? And it's the insidious thing about the system, and I would say the media. And who knows if I ever find time to write an article about this, because I think it's a decent one to do. Basically, our media doesn't lie so much through blatant propaganda, I would argue. Our media lies by just simply saying it doesn't fucking exist.
Yeah,
like
that's what it is. It's completely, because we don't have to do outright political censorship. We don't have to do blanket bans on things. I mean, we will, but we're sort of in terms of how we're kind of structured as a sort of liberal democratic bourgeois democracy, you know, and how our empire is kind of structured, like we don't really, we're sort of like past the days of doing like Hays Code type stuff, even though we do still have regulatory frameworks for like media. We just call it something else. But like moderation in itself isn't bad. It's just that there has to be an understanding that certain degree of speech regulation, certain degree of moderation might be necessary, and that every political force on earth does it. The question is, what's the political and class character of it? And who's deciding what gets to be said and what doesn't. And I think that's the really interesting thing. And so I think people would look at like a labor action to stop like fascist propaganda from spreading, or they would look at like a socialist state banning United States media. And you might even have meaningful left critiques of that in terms of how that might function as a strategy. There are certain degrees to which I think sometimes those blanket bans don't really work in the way that they're supposed to, where education would probably be better. But I think that the way that our state does it is either just through miseducation and suppression, while pretending that like the information is available, it's just hard to find, and it's not really put in front of you, and you're constantly bombarded with just copious amounts of crap that you have to sift through to find anything truthful. And so just deliberate miseducation and just lying. And the other thing that we love doing in this country is taking really, really interesting news articles, current events, or moments in history, and just making them as boring as we can possibly make them out to be. Just dry like wallpaper paste, so that nobody cares and people just check out. And it's a way of promoting apathy so that nobody's even remotely curious about what's going on in this country.
Yeah, Canadian history is boring. Like nothing really happened. That's, don't look any further. And honestly, like that was something I felt in high school, and I went on to do history. And certainly like through the Alberta Advantage podcast, like digging more into like the history of Alberta and Canada generally, like you're like, wow, there's actually loads of interesting stuff that's happened, but nobody really talks about it. Like we don't talk about like labor revolts. We don't talk about like the like settler colonialism. We don't talk about any of this stuff. And I guess like growing up, I was like kind of aware of like labor history because I grew up in a former coal mining region. So there's like this sort of weird like cultural memory hangover of like the coal companies and like how just like comically evil they were. And like, but then also that's all gone too. So like the area is like just thoroughly deindustrialized. So there's like kind of like remembrance of like a time when things were at least like more economically better. So like, yeah. And you have to like dig to find stuff about Canadian history, because to an extent it's there, but often there's like, especially like doing like more academic history research, there's like limits to like you'll discover like, oh, there's a big gap here because essentially there hasn't been a historian who's gone and done this yet, because like ultimately all this history is like one way or the other like publicly funded through universities. So
yeah,
and there's like not necessarily a big interest certainly in like producing this for like a popular audience or for like school children.
Yeah, and it's like the whole to your point about information just having huge gaps in terms of what's available. I mean, I think we maybe don't always, and again, this is from our own miseducation, don't always acknowledge the extent to which a lot of stuff just was destroyed, like just fully, just like in extreme cases, like fully just burned. And I'm of course referring to like the obvious thing is, like Nazis burning research material. But even in this country, not that long ago, Stephen Harper, for example, had a bunch of scientific information on oceans and fisheries. Literally, they burned it. They destroyed it. Why? Because it put a lot of his business buddies in a very bad light. It made the government's just general inaction on climate change really obvious. It included a bunch of recommendations that would have directly contradicted a lot of business interests. And so it wasn't just suppressed, it was destroyed. And like that's a huge loss, not just for, ultimately our survival, but like so much stuff. Like for me, as like a annoying art person, I have a really big interest in curation. and archiving, and the way that art is privatized and held in vaults and locked behind IP, it means a lot of stuff does not get preserved. If it does get preserved, it's basically left to rot in vaults unless it can be remastered or something and made profitable. But a lot of stuff in this country, a lot of Canadian content, a lot of cultural content, nowhere to be found. You can't find it. It doesn't exist. Why? Because it was allowed to either burn or rot, or just generally fall into disuse and was never preserved. It wasn't digitized. It was nothing. And that includes a lot of indigenous cultural content in this country as well, right? A lot of, literally whole cities burned to the ground, cultural artifacts destroyed, languages destroyed, so like we're past that point. We're now in this sort of liberal hegemony of sort of pretending that we care about free speech. But for a really, really huge stretch of time historically for us, I mean, we were violent settler colonialists. We still are, but that really openly included just outright cultural genocide, which is still going on.
Certainly, like, to add to that as well, like the Harper government got rid of the long form census, and they argued, of course, that it was protecting people's privacy, but like a big part of this is the a big part of the long form census is like it allows the social democratic welfare state to be able to like administer all these different programs and stuff, and without that knowledge of like what kind of population you're dealing with, you're unable to like effectively administer this. So it makes the welfare programs like much harder to deliver if you don't know much about like who you're delivering them to. And
yeah, because they know that they're always going to be able to service their own class, who will always be able to buy into the whatever services exist. And for those populations that like need state services, that rely on them, that do not have the capital, that do not have the means to access those same services, they can just sort of be neglected to death. And that's what we're seeing now in the pandemic. And that, I think, also slots into the lack of public medical research in this country, because of all of our public labs were privatized. And so now it's actually made our COVID response more inefficient. It's made our vaccine research and development much weaker than it would have been if we had properly funded our public labs instead of selling them off piecemeal to private companies. So the privatization of culture and the destruction of culture and the sort of replacement of it with the sort of ideological interests of the class that destroyed all those things is like really, really palpable in crisis situations like this, where it's a life and death thing if people don't know what the right information is.
Oh yeah, I mean, like Alberta, the previous NDP government did end some of the lab privatization that had been carried out by the previous PC government, but then they started construction of a new super lab in Edmonton, and as soon as the UCP got in, they canceled it. So then we were in this like wonderful spot where they were trying to privatize the remainder of all the lab services as the pandemic was hitting. And I think the UCP did walk back on it just because of all the chaos it would have caused in the pandemic response. But they've been waiting very patiently for this to be over so they can continue to like privatize and cut. Like they announced in like July or August that like as soon as the pandemic's over, they're going to fire 11,000 healthcare workers, mostly so they can privatize all these, like, and it's mostly not like direct like frontline like people who are like actually delivering healthcare. It's like people who have all the support roles, and in particular like they tend to be like the lower paid public sector workers and like primarily like women of color who they clean hospital rooms, they clean sheets, they do laundry, they do all these like really important like stuff that keeps the healthcare system functioning. And the government said like as soon as this is over, we're firing you all, and like it's going to be privatized. And like and what's exceptionally hilarious about it is that, well, I mean, like very darkly hilarious, is that the person who's like lobbying the government for this is like Jason Kenney's former chief of staff, Nick Koolsbergen, and he's actually been his like lobbying firm has been like the one that like virtually every like company that's interested in like getting a bit of whatever is being privatized like goes through.
Mhm.
And then it's also like gotten Kenny into all these like funny scandals, like the whole like vacationing during the lockdown was because WestJet lobbied through this guy's firm lobbied the government to say like we want like a special exception that there'd be like a special um like accelerated program for people to travel between Alberta and Hawaii. And when all of this came out, that a bunch of like cabinet ministers had gone to Hawaii, Jason Kenney started the press conference by saying like, look, we don't want WestJet to fail. That's why these people went there. Like this is like an important part of keeping the economy alive is flying.
Okay.
And then just said like, and we're not going to punish anybody. And then like 3 days later came back and like released a Facebook statement saying he'd asked them all to resign.
That is so funny in the context of what happened to Nikki Ashton traveling to visit her like dying grandmother, and she was like reprimanded for that. And it was like the Canadian media ecosystem made so much hay, and like the right wing of the NDP made so much hay out of saying that, you know, that she was a hypocrite and that she had violated these safety precautions. And, you know, to whatever extent you want to criticize her for that, the response was so outsized in comparison to what she had actually done. When you think of just all of these ghouls, you know, who are openly flouting the rules they impose on others, who are making these incredibly contradictory rulings and instituting these policies that just plain make no sense, that are making it very clear that there are rules for some people and other rules for other people, and who are, you know, they're going to parties, they're going on vacation, they're going and it's all their friends, so they don't want to punish them. You know, what are they going to do? Send each other to jail? Fine each other? I mean, this is the class of people, you know, politicians and professional class people and business class people who are all doing this stuff, and then insisting that they have to keep their businesses open and that it's vital to the economy and will not provide any relief for anyone else in a way that they can't also find a way to profit from. So it's that I think that huge hypocrisy is one of those things that I am thankful to a certain degree that the right wing as it is in this country is somewhat splintered, relatively, because there is so much antipathy, I mean, towards the government in this response, because nobody really knows what's going on. Everything feels totally hypocritical and contradictory. Nobody even really understands what the rules are, and they change all the time. And it just really seems like we could have handled this in a coherent way if we like gave a shit about regular people. And this whole thing has just kind of exposed that, you know, there's a rule for one class of people and there's rules for other classes of people. And, you know, it's a little club and you're not in it. Like, that's what it's kind of shown everybody.
Yeah, I mean, in one club we wash our hair with shampoo, and in another club we use dog like food to do it.
That's right.
And if you don't use dog food, you don't get published.
It's one of those things where it's if you're rich, it's classy, and if you're poor, it's gross to wash your hair with dog food. I see how it is. I see the double standards at work.
Oh man. Yeah. So basically, one of the things that I think has kind of become clear because of the pandemic, in terms of, there's an interesting, I think it was Globe and Mail article about like that kind of shows exactly what you're talking about in terms of the fact that the governments don't really care about us. Is think of something as basic as like toilets, right? There's a severe lack of public toilets, and like I don't know if this is a case across the country, right? But like you look at Ontario, like I can speak to this from an example. When I was fortunate enough to go and cover the Air Collective's basically encampment, that was first in City Hall and then basically in Dufferin Grove Park, right? So they were fortunate enough to have basically limited access to toilets throughout. But in the other case, basically when they're at Dufferin Grove Park, basically city staff were actively basically closing the washrooms like 4 or 5 hours earlier than usual. Some days they wouldn't even be open. And this is like one of the better ones I've seen, like just in general, right? In terms of public services, it's been so hollowed out. It's utterly insane because it's the idea of a government is to invest in people, but of course we live under capitalism in the end of the day, so it's not so much of a surprise as it is just a disappointment. But I mean, it's just something that isn't acceptable, right? I'm wondering, like, funny state, like, what's the state of public washrooms in like Alberta and Quebec?
I mean, yeah, public toilets are like a really classic example of like the privatization of public space and just how they've disappeared. I mean, generally, there's not really a lot in Calgary. I mean, during the summer when we would hang out in parks socially distance, there's a park nearby house, and like the sun's out. Like the sun doesn't set till like after 9:30 and closer to like 10 o'clock in Calgary in the summer. So like people are out enjoying the sun in the park, and then the city's just like closing the washrooms at like 7 p.m. And one of my friends was there. She went to go to the washroom and then discovers it's locked. But not only it's locked, there's a woman who's been locked inside there. So basically, the city just came and just locked all the washrooms and didn't even bother checking. So this woman had been trapped there for like 20 minutes. So then they had to. Yeah, well, she was just like she'd gone to the washroom and the city employee came by and just locked the door, and so she was locked inside.
Just
And-
knock.
Yeah, and so she so basically then they had to call the city to come and let her out, and that was like a whole like another 20 minutes before somebody showed up and let her out. And like the woman was just there playing like football or something.
Oh my god. It's a similar situation here where I don't think we have especially under Legault, but even before that, we have been suffering under the yoke of austerity measures for quite some time. It's become really undeniable during the pandemic in terms of what it's done to, I mean, much of it has been made of the LTEs, the private care homes, but the public care homes in Quebec are also massive centers of disease spread, largely for reasons related to just lack of funding, lack of investment in public services, lack of renovations for a lot of these old buildings that the public care homes are operating out of, that these buildings were built a very long time ago and have not been updated since. And it's, bars on the windows and tiny little small rooms that are poorly ventilated and then lots of people in one room. And so of course it's leading to disaster. And you can interpret that. I interpret that as a willful neglect of the government to create conditions that are so hostile in these.
Am I freezing? Am I freezing up?
Not to me.
A little bit. Well, it wasn't your voice wasn't synced up with your video.
Okay, I'll just go ahead. Just go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I interpret that as a deliberate act of neglect to make these public care homes so inhospitable that they're opened up to privatization. So there's like a similar thing happening here that's being talked about less, that you can compare to what Kenny is doing to healthcare in Alberta. In terms of things like toilets, we do have them. They exist. At libraries and occasional public stalls, but not nearly to the extent that they should. And we have a pretty severe homelessness problem, which I actually think we should maybe talk about because there was like a recent ruling regarding the COVID exemption rules. And so we do have them, but the vast majority of them are operated by private businesses and you got to pay to go in, and a lot of them have locks on the doors, especially downtown. So around like the gay village and around like Place des Arts and like Saint Laurent, that is a pretty big area for like meth users and like people who use pretty hard drugs. Like that's kind of like the center of where you see most of that in the city. And so like that's an area where it's like almost every bathroom is private except for the one at the National Library. And every single one of them has like complex locks on the doors and like black lights. So it's impossible to see what you're doing because they don't want people doing drugs in there. This has been capitalism's solution to the problem of widespread drug use amongst the homeless population in the city.
Yeah, I mean, that's very similar in Calgary is there's a severe opioid epidemic in Alberta, and it's like preventing people, like just locking all the washrooms so people can't do drugs in them. I mean, also like the way that public transit, particularly the light rail transit system in Calgary is designed, the stations are, since all the downtown stations and the sort of inner city stations where a lot of the homeless population lives are all just like open platforms. There's just all there is like a shelter to protect against like snow and rain and wind to an extent, but like there's no indoor heated parts to these stations. But if you go into the suburbs, particularly the wealthier ones, the stations actually have like internal, or like parts that are inside where it's like warmer, which is nice because like in the winter it's like really cold. It'll get really, really cold, and you're just standing on this platform waiting for the train, and it's minus 30. And they design all the stations like downtown, and like you look at the benches downtown, they've got the dividers on them to ensure you can't lie on them and all that fun stuff. And as well as like some of the foundations that help homeless people are also like connected with like fundamentalist Christianity as well. So it's not just like letting you in from the cold, it's also like giving you like a lecture about Jesus.
Yeah, and I think when we were chatting before this, Lana, there's something you wanted to talk about, and I think is absolutely worth talking about, is the anniversary of the mosque shooting. Now, Rob did a good piece in terms of like good talk about right-wing extremism and the lead up to that, but would you want to talk a little bit about that? I mean, I assume everyone knows about it, but I think it's something that should be really talked about. So
sure. And I almost wish that it had come up when we were talking about like the right-wing media ecosystem in Canada and how that fuels right-wing ideology, how it acts as a recruitment and acts as an indoctrination tool. But more than that, it also acts as a sort of activation tool for people who are, because of their class subject position, already sort of prone to that ideology. So it's sort of like it's a way of kind of pushing them over that edge. And that's, I think, with the mosque shooting and similar acts of terroristic violence that have taken place in this country, I don't think you can really separate it from the right-wing media ecosystem. And I think it's actually really hard when you look at how many of these guys are openly professing to have been, say, inspired by people like Ben Shapiro to commit acts of violence. At that point, it becomes really untenable to make the argument that these things don't matter and don't have a real impact. Of course, you should never take what a right-wing psychopath says at their word, but it is very, very obvious that even if you just look at their online activity, their offline activity, all of the references that they make, it's very, very clear that they're all kind of inspired by a similar intellectual sphere, right? That there's a certain sphere of sort of pseudo-intellectuals that are laundering these ideas and providing the kind of not really intellectual justification for why they do the things that they do. And it also makes it really clear to me, like when these things happen, that none of what happens in this country remains within its own borders. That like we are as plugged into global capitalism and into these global political currents as any other country. And there's a sort of, I think, almost knee-jerk tendency sometimes with political commentators in this country to stop at the border. And some of that, I think, is because there's a certain hang-up of, we're thought of as like America Junior, and we don't really have like a national character of our own, and we don't really consider our own context and the direct material conditions of our own particular regions in this country. And like, that is true to an extent. And like, you do have to sort of still be engaged and conscious of your local environment. Like that's really important. But these movements are international. And I'm sorry, but to a certain extent, we kind of are America Junior in a lot of ways. We respond very much to the things that they do. And there is cultural influence that they have on us, and vice versa. And the bourgeoisie and the ruling class that promotes these right-wing ideologies, they have an international consciousness. They don't operate within their own borders, and they're sharing information and resources and manpower with each other all the time. They are constantly collaborating with one another. And when these little these eruptions of horrific violence spring up, there's always an international connection. And that became really obvious when we found out, like, oh yeah, all of these guys are like listening to, you know, the intellectual dark web or whatever it's called. You know, all of these guys are talking to each other. All of these guys are collaborating with each other. All these guys are listening to each other. So that's why my outlook is much bigger than the Canadian border or, you know, what's going on in my own city. And I think it kind of has to be to understand like the overall project that these guys are pursuing. Even though it might be like articulated nationalistically, there's something behind that that's going on. There's a broader and I think deeper ideological project to institute a certain class order or to reinforce a certain class order in society, where nationalism just kind of serves as a pretext for that.
For sure. And I think, Lana, there's actually a question for you in Facebook. I missed it until now. It only came in 2 minutes ago, actually, luckily. But Rory Smooter was asking, what's the latest in Quebec in terms of the resistance to the religious symbols ban in terms of public sector jobs? So I think Bill 21, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't, since that happened, I don't know that many people around me who are particularly fond of this religious rule. And I think that it's pretty obvious, although it's not clear where the organized movement against that is at this point, at least as far as I'm concerned. The last thing that I've saw about that, that's a really good question, because I don't know that there's actually been any like mounted resistance from organized labor in terms of like fighting this ruling. But I do know that there have been, if anything, advocacy groups, particularly from certain religious communities or ethnic communities, saying, you know, this is obviously racist, and this is obviously very hypocritical, unfair rule that doesn't work in practice and is mostly just a way of further marginalizing largely Muslim women. More than anybody else. That's who suffers the most from rules like this. Ultimately, it's going to be women of color. It's ultimately going to be women who, if you wear visible religious symbols, puts you at a higher risk of public persecution. And like, I think that's a lot of what I think that's how a lot of it needs to be understood, that whenever again, it's like when the far right talks about nationalism, when the Quebec government talks about secularism, that's a bunch of bullshit. Like, because there are Christian religious symbols all over this province. And they might say, well, you're not allowed to wear, you know, a cross or whatever at work. But honestly, there's nothing stopping you from just tucking it under your shirt or something. So, you know, it means a lot more if it's, you know, like a religious headdress or a covering that you can't take off versus something that you can easily hide. And also it means a lot more if you're a religious minority that's already at risk of social and political persecution versus if you practice the mainstream religion of Catholicism in this province, where like there are crosses all over the place. No one's taken them down. No one's going to. Why would they? So, you know, like it's just a very obvious hypocrisy that I think I would have to look at surveys to see across in terms of provincially, like how much approval there is. But at least in Montreal, there's not a lot of love for this particular bill.
Yeah, well, that's at least somewhat of a relief to hear. Now, there's obviously some other news in Quebec, and there's another thing you mentioned in terms of there's news. I think it's a Montreal, it's a CTV news article you linked to me, basically around trans rights, I believe it is. Could you maybe talk to people about that?
Oh, yeah. So this was a really recent ruling. A Quebec judge found it basically unconstitutional that trans specifically, this was a ruling regarding trans parents and the right of trans parents to list their gender appropriately on the birth certificate of their children, which was the fact that this particular family was unable to change the gender of one parent, or change the you know, like the state gender classification of one parent, was found to be a violation of that person's human rights, of this woman. And so that was struck down. There were a bunch of different associated rulings with that, in terms of if you could change like birth certificate gender assignations, which was all recently ruled unconstitutional. And a lot of that is thanks to work put in by the Center for Gender Advocacy, which is like a working group that operates out of Concordia. So, and that's actually, there are lots of bad things that are happening in this province, but that's like one of the few really positive and hopeful things that happened. So, you know, and that's really nice, because it's not, it's a small step in the right direction. You know, it doesn't solve the homelessness issue. It doesn't solve the housing crisis. It doesn't solve workplace discrimination, but at the very least, it's a little bit of a shred of dignity, and a way for people to properly have themselves identified in the eyes of the state, which is kind of an important thing for like a bunch of different census related reasons. But yeah, I mean, it's a small thing, but it is a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. That's it's at least something positive. I suppose it's good to know. So I guess I want to ask basically Rory and Lana, both of you, is there any particular news info you'd want to bring up to people now? Because I'm thinking we might be nearing like the end of the stream. I'm just wondering before we kind of lean towards the ending.
I mean, I think I touched on most of kind of like recent like Alberta political stuff. I mean, other than I guess like surprisingly the UCP government has like run into like a lot of unpopularity over what it's been doing, which is like somewhat heartening to see. But I mean, like polls in Alberta like do tend to like understate how understate like support. Polls tend to understate actual support for conservatives in Alberta. So like often like you should just like assume like whatever the conservatives are polling at, just add several more points to it. And Alberta's got a long tradition of just like hating a conservative government, and then just like re-electing it again and again and again. But I mean, in some respects, the pandemic has like made it feel like a lot of political stuff is like kind of suspended right now, like just like waiting for things to like for this to be over, and then like maybe some big stuff will come down. I think we're probably in for some like significant public sector labor unrest. There was a one-day wildcat strike in Alberta in late October. The government has sort of like publicly stated it's like ready to go to war with the public sector, but they've been doing it in such a way that it's like more likely to actually just provoke a huge strike rather than the government would necessarily win. So it's kind of hard to see what's going to happen. I mean, Kenny is certainly very personally unpopular, and people aren't happy. And I think even like the hardcore right flank of the conservative base is like drifted away from Kenny, because they've certainly been unhappy with the lockdowns we've had in Calgary, like fairly sizable for Calgary, like anti-mask protests. So we'll see.
So I mentioned the homelessness crisis and the recent ruling regarding the COVID curfew fine, which, I mean, this is going to, in general, the weird, inconsistent, ineffectual COVID rules that we have in this province, which makes Legault's continued approval rating all the more confounding, because anyone you actually talk to on the street about this will go, I don't understand what the rules are or why this, like, you know, they have these real weird rules about what you can buy in stores now that make no sense. They have these weird rules about, yeah, like they'll have like stock in the stores that they refuse to sell because of COVID related rules, but nobody can figure out the rhyme or reason. And a lot of it is just kind of left up to the franchisees. So it's like managers deciding what can be sold and what can't. So it's inconsistent even across franchises. And there was like a recent, this might have been a little bit of like an influencer doing a work on people, but there was a recent story of this woman who had taken a video of her shopping at Jean Couture. It was a Black woman, and all of the other hair care products were available for purchase except for specifically the Black hair care products. And it had been like that one manager deciding that for whatever reason that stock couldn't be sold for vaguely COVID related reasons. And there's other things too, like the curfew in itself is really confusing and nonsensical, and nobody can figure out if Legault thinks that COVID is like a kind of werewolf that only comes out at night. Total nonsense. And for a time, and this is kind of what I really wanted to get to, for a time up until very recently, that is to say a few days ago, actually, there had been no exemption for homeless people, despite the fact that shelters at the best of times are over full and understaffed and not numerous enough, and, you know, just generally underfunded and close all the time. And under, you know, in pandemic circumstances, it's been even worse, and they've been closed much more frequently. And in this case, there was a man who actually died from exposure because he was stuck out in the cold. I think he had tried to hide in a porta potty. He couldn't get into a shelter because it was closed for COVID cleaning, and there were no other shelters available. And he couldn't get into, he had nowhere to go. And they were, the SPVM had actually up to that point been basically following this ordinance to fine anybody who was out past 8 p.m., including homeless people. And it's not a small fine, it's $1,400. It's a sizable fine. And a man died. A man died because of just general neglect in terms of this response. And that created a public outcry, that created a lot of outrage. And even our mayor, Valerie Plante, who I think has certain drawbacks, you know, she's kind of left of center neoliberal type of person. But even she very carefully and very diplomatically was saying, you know, it's not okay to fine and murder homeless people, and we should have an exemption for them. To which Legault responded, and she also made some comments about police misconduct and corruption, to which Legault responded, "Why don't you support the police? Why are you so anti-police?" And he also made he at first refused to rule in favor of an exemption for homeless people on grounds that what if people pretended to be homeless so that they could go out at night and then they could waive the fine? That was his rationale for allowing more homeless people to die or get fined and pay money they don't have. And he was forced by a judge, actually, to finally create an exemption in the past few days for homeless people after like weeks of this. So that's who the guy that people think is doing a great job, and I can't figure. It's very like Andrew Cuomo. Like I can't figure out why people like this guy so much.
That's a really good comparison, actually. Yeah, Rory, you're gonna jump in though.
Oh yeah, we're really showing up Alberta in like in just like comical cruelty to people. Wow. I mean, interestingly, Alberta, like yeah, like the Cuomo comparison, is interesting. Like where it's just like get out in front of the cameras and every day and make it sound like you're doing something, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. People will like credit you with it. Like interestingly, that hasn't worked for Kenny. Like generally, nobody is happy with the Alberta government's handling of this, and it's like really really blown back onto Kenny and his like personal popularity. So I mean, people are just pissed about it.
And yeah, I mean, I can totally understand that. I mean, like, I don't know if it's really hitting Doug Ford really. Somehow the liberals seem to be benefiting from this. Like people, like if you want to talk about political brain rot among the populace, kind of pushed by like neoliberal media, and it's more aggressive in Alberta's case, but it's just as present in Ontario. Like, look, the ONDP are not good. Like they are nowhere near what we need as a left party. They are barely center left at best. Like you think of like censoring pro BDS figures in the party like Joel Hardin and so forth. Look, I'm not gonna cheer for them, but look, they should be leading the polls. They're the least shit by far. And I'm not gonna endorse them, suggest them in any sort of way. But the fact to me that they like it's a kind of a political strategic failure on their part that they aren't top, right? Because like you think of news I want to bring up, like we still have billions of unspent dollars, and like the federal government just gave us free money, and our government was just like, no, we're not going to spend it. We'd rather have tons of outbreaks in schools. We'd rather have basically our long-term care home be like practically a COVID factory, because we don't give a shit about our elderly people in this province. And it's kind of it is insanity to me that generally that like Ford has really seemingly gotten away with what he's done to a certain degree. It's cruelly ironic that a pandemic took Doug Ford from like the 20% popularity to like could win a majority. Like that's like the screwed up state of Ontario politics, where it's like there's definitely local movements and parties and activists that are pushing for better, and I'll always give a shout out to the Communist Party. But like it's just a really frustrating situation. Like you think of like Toronto, like John Tory's pretty much as much of a damn neolib as you can get. It's just because he's not Doug Ford or Rob Ford's smoking crack. Basically, everyone's like, oh yay, we can. It's like the Biden with the libs. We literally got the Biden and the libs effect. Like he was like our Trump. And then we got John Tory, which was just the libs going back to brunch. And so basically, we're not like helping homeless people. Our shelter system is fucked. Basically, we have like, sorry, I'm getting soft here. Basically, we have just so many people that are basically struggling out there on the streets, right? Because at the end of the day, basically, you can have the shelters, but the way we even like in terms of funding for shelters and funding for cleaning, basically, the shelters that we have are overcrowded. They're COVID spreaders. And so people are being forced to choose between like freezing outside or potentially dying of COVID. And so like, yeah, I guess my main thing would be like just John Tory sucks. Like no level of our government is going to save us. Like that's the brutally honest situation you have. I guess if I had a final message, it was just, and I think we'll have like little plugs after this, but like organize, get involved in direct action on the ground, or like where you can, obviously, because lockdowns a lot of the country for good reason, but where you can, get involved in organizing, because like the politicians ain't gonna save us, man. They aren't gonna save us.
Yeah. Or even, I mean, to whatever extent you can get involved, like do it. But even if your extent of that right now is advocacy and like sending like money and resources to organizations like who are, that need it and are trying to do the right things, even that is meaningful.
Yeah.
I think also too, like, so I want to go back a little bit to like the Law 21, and in terms of, and also the sort of like COVID response stuff, where there's this sort of weird contradiction in terms of the sort of general consensus in terms of what surveys or polling says and what you actually get when you talk to people about this stuff. And it makes me wonder how these polls are being conducted and who is being surveyed, because like with the COVID stuff, I don't know a single person who likes these rules or thinks that they make sense, even if they have some politically incoherent or immature takeaway from it. There's definitely a certain degree of cognitive dissonance in terms of like, why are we doing this? How is this helping us? And if you talk to like working people, just that you see around, that's the general vibe. And there's a similar thing with Law 21, where I think there is a lot. I'm not going to say Quebec is not a racist province, because like, holy shit, it's like insanely racist. Like, it's super racist. But it varies depending on where you are in the province in terms of like how homogenous and what the class character of like that place is. Like, Quebec City is a very white, very homogenous, very upper middle class place compared to Montreal, which tends to have a more active organizing base. So like that has, and Quebec City is known for being like a bastion of like white supremacist far right organizations. So not like a big surprise there. So it varies a lot. But like in terms of the weird contradiction where you see general support for these policies reflected in polling, but then actually talking to people and you get them talking about it for like 5 minutes and they're like, yeah, this makes no fucking sense. Like, this is a weird rule that nobody understands and doesn't really help anybody. But I think because there's no, outside of small advocacy groups or interest groups working around specific issues, and organized labor exists, but it's weakened and it only really kind of shows, raises its head under certain circumstances. Because that isn't there to capture that radical potential and that mass energy and that mass discontent and funnel it into something proactive, that sense of disillusionment with the government just isn't really being reflected properly and isn't really being turned into anything. And the sort of right-wing elements of this province have a lot more influence and power because there's this kind of vacuum in terms of actually organizing people, having like, there's no, like, the Communist Party exists, but it's not really a powerful political force. There's no like big mass workers party, we have strong union representation here. We have a lot of organizing here and it is valuable, but it's pretty disaggregated. There's no like central command or anything. And even though there's a lot of discontent on the ground, it's not necessarily being funneled up into anything. Like, I remember when the mosque shooting happened, there was this huge vigil that I attended that turned into a march. And it was, attended by like thousands of people. And this is, and you could even think about that in the context of like the student strikes that happened before that, these huge waves of people, this big radical energy that came out. And that, you can't say that didn't result in some degree of victories and certainly a certain degree of like positive momentum for people here. But for example, I've been to several like BLM marches, and what does the government do in response to these BLM marches? They increase the police budget this year. That's what they did, so yes, that the organizing apparatus exists here. Yes, I'm glad that it exists. There's so much more to be done and to like channel the energy that I think people have and the anger that people have that's kind of just resolving into apathy and inaction and actually turning it into something. Because I think there's a lot more that we can do. And we've done it in the past. We did it with the student strikes, but the student strikes also had like a really strong student organizing body behind it. And that's what really helped it. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the state of organized labor is obviously a bit center-right currently. And I think if there's enough investment, enough organizing, I think you can turn labor to the left. There's definitely the potential there. But like, you think of the Canadian Labour Congress leadership endorsing Bill Morneau for, I think, the OCED like top position there. And I think basically Rory, in terms of Alberta Advantage, has done some where like, basically there's a danger of basically not like having left organizing in labor unions, because like, I mean, you can speak to this more, but like there's a history of kind of these unions and these kind of figures basically when they're center right, like actively trying to wind these movements down when they gain any strength.
Well, I mean, part of it is like, well, for one thing, like Alberta does not have like as strong a labor history as say Quebec or Ontario does, and for a variety of reasons, including like we've had like decades of like of governments that have been like incredibly hostile to organized labor. But I mean, one of the big things is like labor is like not really so much like inherently a politically radical force. Like labor is like a response to like the issues with capitalism. So basically it's a way of of like trying to like mediate, like workers being able to like try and get like bigger shares of the surplus that they produce. And so like one of the big things, there's this contradiction within labor, is that it wants to be an accepted institution in order to like basically just like not be repressed and like be able to like have employers negotiate with them. So it wants like to be part of a legal framework that accepts it. But the of course the problem with that is that like it also is a way of like kind of co-opting a labor into the process, and then there does become like internally within unions an incentive to not to like squash radicals, and because that they can upset things. So I mean, in some senses, like if like Alberta gets any kind of like serious like labor unrest, it's like more because the government like went and provoked labor in like a kind of like tactically stupid way from the perspective of the government. And because like even like the nurses union here was saying like strikes are a last resort and we don't want to have to do that, and while the government is like announcing like big austerity coming. And I mean, yeah, that's something we certainly talked about a lot, and you see this a lot in like the history of like labor struggles, is this tension between like, well, if we like push harder, we can get more, but then also like, but if we push harder, like that also will invite the state to crush us, when really we just want to be like an accepted social and political institution that is like, part of our like liberal democratic society, rather than being like necessarily like an independent political force. As well as like labor in Canada, and particularly in Alberta, is like it tends to outsource its like political action to the NDP to its detriment, because the Alberta NDP in power, like they did pass a lot of like labor law reforms, but like all these like labor law reforms were just basically bringing Alberta's like labor regime up to the Canadian average. It wasn't like pushing it forward. And but like for the public sector, they basically made them all eat zeros for pay increases, because the previous conservative governments like made like constantly had pay freezes and all that other fun stuff. And then the NDP's like argument to like labor leadership was like, well, like we have to be seen by the electorate as like being like tough and willing to like control spending, so we're going to not give you any pay increases. And the labor leadership like generally agreed with that. And the whole reasoning is like, well, you wouldn't want the conservatives in power, they're just going to make you eat shit. And well, the conservatives get in power. But as I always say, no government but social democrats can make organized labor eat shit better. Like conservatives, if they try it, like to an extent, like labor will at least make a show of like fighting back and maybe actually do some fighting back. But social democrats will just like, labor will say, thank you very much, more please.
Yeah, so I guess, Lana, do you have anything you want to say on that front?
Oh, well, I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people are under the assumption that it's easier for organized labor under social democratic regimes. Like it's easier because they have a more sympathetic ear in government. And I fundamentally agree with you. I mean, I've had this conversation, I've had this argument with people where they're like, that's actually not necessarily true. And like a lot of, especially in the West, like I think a lot of people conflate like the way social democracy functions in like Bolivia, with the way like the Nordic social democratic models work, or how it would function here if it really existed, which would not be remotely the same, because our relationship to empire is completely different. And the super exploitation that like maintains this country is completely different. And that means that the complexion of labor in this country is also completely different. And like I have a friend who put it in a kind of a funny, a little bit reductive, but funny way, where he said like, Canada is a nation of labor aristocrats. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the unionized trades. That's unfortunate, but it's true. And part of that is a part of a general project of de-radicalizing the left, that came out of like the sort of post New Deal and post welfare reform pressures of the mid 20th century, and the legal reforms to integrate unions kind of into the mechanisms of the state, which required and quite literally required in a lot of cases ousting communists from those unions, ousting radicals, or at least keeping them in positions of subordination where they can never reach leadership. And that the leadership that was and is present in those unions is totally sold out. You know, they totally, they're class collaborators, and they openly collaborate with business, and they'll talk about, and they'll openly collaborate with the state, and they'll talk about it as though it's a really good deal for the rank and file. And so that's part of the issue, is that there's this really calcified, sold out leadership at the top that has just never been purged. Even though that I think it's good for people to still be involved in whatever labor institutions exist. You know, if you are a communist, you should still like participate and engage with it. But because there's never been this like purge of this particular leadership, in the same way that like the NDP has never purged itself of its right wing, of its Mulcaris and so on. What it does, it usually purges leftward when it does that at all. It usually finds ways of suppressing and ousting its annoying little left-wing contingent, or funneling its radical energy into sort of ineffectual make-work projects that just don't accomplish anything. And that is like a really important point that I wish more people understood, that social democracy, especially in the West, were it to even exist, which probably it wouldn't, because the rate of profit globally is so low that we're not getting those reforms anytime soon. It's not gonna fucking happen. And most of our economy is a surface economy propped up on debt and speculation, you know, with a very financialized economy, to extract what's left out of the rate of profit, which is rapidly declining, which is why we're selling like ad data as a commodity. Like that's how bad it's gotten. Which is getting into just like into the Marxist weeds, I guess. But that's like why these trade unions are functionally ineffectual, even though they could be really powerful forces for radical change. But that would have to happen if the leadership was kicked out and you know, don't let your ass hit you on the way out. And the power was put back into not just the rank and file, but specifically into unorganized sectors of the economy, which includes a lot of contract and like gig work increasingly. Like that is sort of the way of labor now. It includes organizing sort of semi-criminalized elements of the economy, like sex workers. It includes organizing around tenants unions. It includes organizing around homelessness, sort of the super exploited internal colonies, which would include a lot of migrant labor. That's most of what's left of our agricultural and industrial economy. It's mostly migrant labor who are here on visas. You know, indigenous people and the land back movement, it's all people who are super exploited and who have been sort of locked out of these conventional legal processes of labor that exist. That would be the radical force, I think, in our society that should be organized and could actually make a change.
All right, so I mean, I actually might have to get going in a few minutes. So I guess the one last question from the chat, which is election coming. Let's say an election comes up in the next few months. Who do you think is going to win? Like liberal, conservative? Do you think maybe minority? Do you think NDP somehow pulls out a victory? I'm curious for thoughts.
Oh, I think it'll probably be a liberal majority, and they're going to run on like we didn't truly fuck it up, and that's kind of what it will be. And like, but we'll see. I mean, things could go wild. I would be extremely surprised to see like any kind of like NDP surge, but you know, it's possible, but it's probably going to be, liberal majority, maybe liberal minority.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it would probably just be Trudeau again, because frankly, we don't like, I don't dislike Jagmeet, but we're not really mounting a really critical challenge to what Trudeau is doing. I mean, the last thing Jagmeet did was like having the Proud Boys classified as like a terrorist organization. And before that, it was like relief for small businesses or whatever. Like, not necessarily bad things, but not necessarily what we need either. That would really challenge and really point out the contradictions and failures of the liberal response. And I think that's part of the issue, is that there's not really any strong left momentum electorally. Anytime it happens in this country, we find a way to destroy it. we've really found a good way of like fettering the one social democratic party that we have and making sure that nothing more radical or more to the left of that has any real presence in government. But the other thing too is, and I mentioned this before, is that so far, the conservative movement in this country, while it exists and while it is still a powerful force, is relatively splintered in terms of leadership. And we don't really have our guy yet. We don't really have our like national Trump figure yet. You know, or something worse than Trump, you know, because you can do worse, right? Than him. You can get an outright fascist psychopath and not just, you know, a politically incoherent baby man who happens to be very racist. So there's this kind of splintering on the right, and there's not really this kind of cohesion that would propel like a far right leader to an actual like leadership position in government yet, but I can see that happening, and I think there are seeds of it that are pretty visible, and that as the years go on and as people get more and more disillusioned with the liberals, which happens on a cyclical basis, and as more of, you know, I think what's going to happen, frankly, and I think this is already starting, is that after the benefit period ends for COVID, we're going to be experiencing an enormous austerity backlash as a response. And it's going to be about, you know, all the COVID benefit cheats who use the money incorrectly and we're fraudsters. We're going to go after them. Yeah. And it's going to be like what Rory said with regard to privatizing healthcare right after this is over. It's going to be this enormous austerity backlash against, well, you know, you were given these, we were so gracious to help you during this period of time when you needed it, but now you have to pay us back. And I think when that happens, that's when things are going to really precipitously decline. In terms of electoral outcomes and in terms of what it means for the liberals. And in that, as that happens in that time, I'm going to be looking at what the trends are with the conservative movement and how they, if they're able to kind of find that leadership figure, that sort of charismatic figure that can carry them to some degree of political leadership power in this country again. And I'm sure it's going to happen.
Yeah, there's definitely a constituency for far-right politics in this country, but yeah, there isn't really a leader for it yet.
All right, well, that's a good point to transition to kind of heading off the stream. So, Rory, Lana, basically, where can people find you? Where can people find you and kind of support your work?
Well, the Alberta Advantage is a podcast I do a lot of writing and contribute to, so that's certainly a great place to look at. We tend to focus a bit more on Alberta, but certainly there's a little bit more like Canada stuff, and our kind of shtick is like more of a like doing deep dives and like historical explanations of stuff. Other than that, I'm left Wexit on Twitter, so I'm the only person holding up the demand for an independent socialist Alberta.
So you can find me here actually on twitch.tv/The Freak Museum, which I'm actually hosting this particular channel right now. I did do it. I did it a couple minutes late, but I did do it. And I'll actually be streaming later after this stream a little bit. I'm going to just grab myself a coffee and some dinner, and then I'm going to be streaming Night Trap, which is a FMV from the 90s. That's that's kind of my wheelhouse, is weird shit like that. So I've been doing a series on old DOS games. So I don't know if any of that is interesting to you, but that's sort of what I do. Believe it or not, that's my bread and butter. So if you want to watch me play Night Trap, you can do that at the Freak Museum. And I stream out on average about once a week. I also am a freelance writer and illustrator. So I've written for Reaganfile, I've written for Passage, I've written for a lot of like art, like new media art magazines like Kaleidoscope and Kill Screen, which is like a digital arts journal, and Rhizome, which is like a new media art journal, and like Waypoint, You can catch me all kinds of places. And I write about, when I do write, I generally either am writing about like art criticism of some weird project, or I'm writing about the intersection of art and labor, as particularly in the tech world and how it functions in the tech world. And besides that, I have a Patreon, which is connected to my stream. And that's where you can, become a patron and join my Discord, where we watch movies once a month. We just watched the movie Society by the Brian Yuzna film. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you haven't, it's fantastic. It's this very schlocky class polemic from 1989 that I'm sure you would love. And you can also commission an illustration from me. So that's what I do. That's my silly job.
All right, thanks for that. And so, yeah, so obviously I'm the editor-in-chief of the Canada File. So the first thing I'll do is suggest that people go look in the links of the Twitch broadcast. You'll see the link to the Canada File site. Got a newsletter there. Go sign up for it. You won't ever miss any of the Canada Files content. My Patreon is linked in the chat. It's patreon.com/AidenJonah. Basically, my Twitter is it's just Aiden/Jonah. So it's a fairly simple Twitter name. There's a new stream coming up on Wednesday night, 7 p.m. On basically, it's gonna be focused on foreign policy, because obviously this is the Canadian domestic news show. So I already have Dan Bleckner as a guest. So looking forward to chatting with him. He's always someone who I have a ton of respect for. Hopefully pull on one or two other guests as well. And I've been working on trying to set up a dual PC setup, which is a absolute pain because I've picked up a streaming PC. So big things will be coming up in like mid-March. But in the meantime, I've set up that kind of setup, and so hopefully I'll be able to do kind of like Rob Rousseau style streams, chatting more, watching things, doing these kind of experimenting more, being able to do more than just basically, even though I have a ton of fun in them, news streams. So look forward to that. That could even maybe be tomorrow if tech works out well. If not, probably like Tuesday or Thursday, I'll give it a try. So definitely go follow my Twitch here to not miss on that. Put out notifications. Give it a follow, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me. Obviously, if you're on Facebook, it's Aiden Jonah, but I assume not many people come from Facebook. So yeah, honestly, thanks to the chat. Thank you to Lana. Thank you, Lana. Thank you, Rory. Very appreciative of you taking the time to come on to the news stream.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
And if you need the assistance of a gamer, if you need a gamer's expertise to set up your PC, just let me know.
Well, I might get in touch with you then, because I'm still having technical issues with it. I have the audio. It's transmitting to the other side. The video is working nicely, but the fan is kind of getting really loud in my old PC, and the audio is kind of inconsistent there. It isn't as loud as it should be. So actually, if you could help me sort that out, basically at some point over the next day, a little bit, I would be in your debt. So
yeah, I do want to stress to everybody, I am a gamer. I know that I have many opinions about world events, and for some reason people find that interesting. But please, I must insist upon this point. I am a gamer. So, but that doesn't, part of my reason for saying that is that, first of all, I find it very funny that some of the big, political commentary pundit people in this country know significantly less about the history of this place and how it functions than me, a gamer. And I like to point that out to them because I think it's very humiliating. But also I try to, even though I think Twitch is basically just a vehicle to sell ads to people, and you're basically just a salesperson. That's basically, I mean, if you were to boil down the job of a streamer into a word that makes sense to people outside of that world, I would say you're a salesperson. But that said, I do try to use the platform for some degree of like education and some degree of actual critical analysis, and have it be like more than just a vehicle to sell crap to people. So, but that's kind of like working within the constraints of the medium a little bit. But yeah, I do want to get across to people that you can be like a dumbass clown gamer like me and you can still understand this stuff. It doesn't take, you don't have to be like a 12D chess political genius like brain jujitsu guy to understand this. Most of it's pretty straightforward.
All right. Well, that's going to be the end of the stream. So thank you yet again, like I said before, Lana, Rory, and obviously Andre Goulet as well, who popped on earlier in the stream. So yeah, all the links, all the support Rory, Lana, support the Alberta Advantage podcast, obviously support, if you can, the work I do and the work the Canada Fellows does. And yeah, I'll catch you later.